Great. Well, welcome everyone. Very excited to have you with us today. My name is Gwendolyn Loomis-Smith. I'm the Phyllis Wyeth Director of Learning Engagement here at the Farnsworth Art Museum in Rockland, Maine. And this year, it's a very exciting year for us. It is our 75th anniversary of the Farnsworth Art Museum, and what a wonderful occasion to celebrate Louise Nevelson, and even more so celebrate our new Chief Curator, Jaime DeSimone, who has joined us here at the Farnsworth beginning in summer of 2022. We're happy to have you with us all today, joining from various points in Maine, all up and down the East Coast and the West Coast as well, for this wonderful virtual presentation, as Jaime will talk to us more about Louise Nevelson and her special connection here to the Farnsworth Art Museum and in Rockland as well. We have such a spectacular collection of her works, and in fact, it is the second largest in the country of Louise Nevelson for holdings across museums. So just to give you a bit of background about Jaime before we turn it over to her, Jaime DeSimone came to the Farnsworth to lead our collections and our exhibition programs. With close to 20 years of experience, Jaime has joined us from the Portland Museum of Art, where she served as the Robert and Elizabeth Navick Curator of Contemporary Art. Before that, Jaime was curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art down in Jacksonville, and then also has exhibitions experience from PB Essex Museum and curatorial experience as well from the Addison Gallery of Art, both in Massachusetts. And it should also be noted that Jaime curated an exhibition on Nevelson and contemporaries when she was at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Jacksonville. So this is a subject that is near to her as well. So before we turn the tables over to Jaime to get started, I just wanted to thank you again for joining us. And certainly if you have questions for Jaime, feel free to put them in the Q&A box, and we'll be happy to take a look at those questions, ask Jaime a question or two at the end of her talk. And certainly, so put them in the Q&A box so we can ask her all sorts of things. Jaime, we'll turn it over to you. Thanks very much. I feel like I'm just shouting down the hallway, so it's fantastic to have you here, but welcome, and we'll get started.
Thank you, Gwendolyn, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I wish we were all in person, but nonetheless, we are here together to celebrate this incredible artist, Louise Nevelson, who I think needs no introduction whatsoever, who's commonly referred to as the Grande Dame of contemporary sculpture. And when thinking about what I might present to you today and looking back on her wonderful intersections with the Farnsworth Art Museum, I really wanted to take a deep dive into the museum's history with the artist, our archives, our object records, and our exhibition history to maybe give a unique presentation about this history instead of just looking at it through an artist's biography or professional accomplishments, or perhaps a virtual tour of the exhibition Louise Nevelson Dawn to Dusk, which is on view now, which if you have not seen, I would encourage you to return to the museum when we reopen on February 11th to see that. So today I'm going to, I hope, peel back the curtain on a very rich history of the Farnsworth Art Museum longstanding relationship with the pioneering sculptor Louise Nevelson, who you see here. And that history is so rich that it dates back to 1954, 6 years after the museum opened in 1948. And so that means I had the great pleasure of trying to learn almost 70 years of activity between an artist and her family and an institution and many, many individuals involved in understanding what it means for the Farnsworth to have the second largest repository of her work. So today, what you will learn about are two incredible milestones for the Farnsworth Art Museum. The first, thinking about the Farnsworth as a collecting institution in its 75th year, how do we communicate really important stories about its collection growth over those 75 years. And this object that you're seeing on the left by Louise Nevelson, titled Bronze Bird, is the first acquisition of her work at the institution. So we are going to go down memory lane and learn how that acquisition came to be. And then the next deep dive will look at her first major exhibition at the Farnsworth. And you're seeing an installation shot on the right, in which the museum and I think the entire city of Rockland nicknamed that 1979, the Nevelson year. So when we think of these two moments in time as markers and milestones for Louise Nevelson history with the Farnsworth Art Museum, we can see what a pivotal role a museum can play in crafting an artist's narrative, both on a local stage, but also on an international and national one. So let's start with thinking about Bronze Bird. And of course, I'm now showing you a slide that does not look anything like Bronze Bird, but this is important because in 1952, Louise Nevelson was elected to become a member of the Federation of Modern Painters and Sculptors. And this was a group founded in 1940 by a group of artists including Adolf Gottlieb, Milton Avery, Mark Roscoe, Myram Shapiro, and this was coming out of the Works Progress Administration, so the WPA era, when artists were thinking about how to protect their rights and how to really preserve freedom of expression. So you can see here on the left their mission statement, which basically just summarizes what I just said. And what also I wanted to contextualize the moment of American art in the 1950s. Here we're seeing the rise of abstract expressionism in the United States, where artists like Jackson Pollock, like Mark Roscoe, like William de Kooning and Franz Klein are all being celebrated for this male-dominated style of non-representational art in painting. Yet alongside of that, we have, who we now celebrate today, Louise Nevelson, kind of doing her thing in what we now know, or perhaps consider, non-representational sculpture. So she is emerging simultaneously in this field. And so it's really important that some of these same artists who are working in this arena protected by the Federation of Modern Painters and Sculptors are welcoming her into this organization and recognizing her artistic merits at this really pivotal moment, the same year that she makes Bronze Bird, which I showed you on the first slide. And so my computer will advance. Hold on. And so this is where, as a curator and as someone new into the institution, I have had the luxury of culling and going through all of our object files and trying to understand how did this acquisition come to be. And what's so incredible in thinking about correspondence in the 1950s between individuals, it's all done by paper mail, sometimes typewritten letters, sometimes handwritten letters, correspondence that has gone through standard museum acquisition process that has taken just about 6 months, which is pretty standard in current practice that we would go through an artist conversation for potential acquisition today. And so this is a scan of the letter that Harold Weston, then president of the Federation of Modern Painters and Sculptors, wrote to Wendell Hadlock, who was the director of the Farnsworth. And you can see in this letter of April 22nd of 1954 that I actually mistyped the director's name, but I guess that happens back in those days. But what is most important of this letter is you can see the quotation that I pulled out and enlarged for us, where Mr. Weston writes, quote, "She may be the one living artist with a national reputation who, although born elsewhere, considers Rockland as a part of her origin. It would therefore seem most suitable for Louise Nevelson to be represented in your museum." And basically the rest of this letter outlines an opportunity for, through the generous support of a donor, the Federation to gift a work of art to the Farnsworth. And this would be, of course, the first acquisition of her work to come into being. Of course, Wendell Hadlock, presumably aware of Louise Nevelson's sculptures and reputation and emerging status as an artist at this time, wonderfully accepts this generous letter that comes his way and replies to Harold Weston again through letter and saying, yes, please send me some images. And of course, I think today we take for granted the rise of the digital age and technology, and usually images were shared via slides or photographs. So this happens. Harold Weston again replies and outlines 3 objects that the museum might consider for acquisition. And again, this is quite standard, but also a luxury at the time that the museum had the ability to consider these. And what I think is so interesting of this letter is that there are 3 very different works. We have bird bronze, which we see here, which ultimately ends up being acquired by the museum. Mountain Woman, which is an aluminum work, which is all we know about it to date is that it is 24 inches long. And then Lady by the Sea, another bronze work about 26 inches long. And then what I find so fascinating about this letter is that my interpretation of it is that Mr. Weston goes on to celebrate and perhaps pitch Mountain Woman to the Farnsworth, noting all the ways in which it was reproduced, exhibited, referred to in various art newspapers, therefore validating its status as a notable work of art by Louise Nevelson. And so that's something a lot of times museum will consider in an acquisition process. If the work has been viewed publicly before or written about in any major publication, thinking about, larger critical acclaim or recognition. But even though Harold Weston was making his plea for the institution to consider Mountain Woman, we now know that the institution went in a very different direction. And before Wendell Hadlock writes back to the Federation, he reaches out to Louise Nevelson himself and lets her know that the museum has acquired a work of art and that we're going to put it on view. This is, again, standard practice. We always want to let artists know that their work has been acquired. We hope they will stay engaged with us and come see the work, maybe come to a talk and whatnot, and just cultivate that relationship, particularly with living artists. And then, unbeknownst to me at the time, what was so exciting is that in our files, we have this handwritten letter from Louise Nevelson herself. So you can only imagine, as someone who is a huge admirer of her work, that I almost gasped when I came upon this in the archives. And I think what is most pleasurable to me and the words that Louise Nevelson uses, and you can see I pulled them out in case anyone has trouble reading her handwriting. She says, "It gives me great pleasure that your museum will accept this gift and that this object remains in our collection to this day, and in fact, on view in the current exhibition." And then, of course, Wendell Hadlock closes the loop by writing back to Mr. Weston. And you can see that this final date is in January 1959. So we're talking from April to January, a good 6 months, very standard practice, but I also think incredibly speedy timeline, thinking about the fact that this was not done via email at all for any current technology in place. And so I also was interested in seeing that the museum over the years has kept onto original object labels of when Braunsberg first went on view. And so thinking about how the work has been contextualized for audiences over time. And so here we see and learn that the funds were provided by Louise Nevelson's sister, Anita Berlowski, and the way that the curator at the time talks about this work is thinking about its formal carvings and the way it is cast, relating it to primitive art and cubism, its simplified forms. Of course, its title suggests that it is drawing its formal relationships to that of a bird. And at that time, the author of this, what we call a chat label, reproduces Harold Weston's kind of pitch to director Hadlock at the time, talking about Louise Nevelson's relationship and how she called Rockland her adopted home. So this is in 1952. The work is made in 1952. This acquisition transpires in the second half of 1954 into January 55. And alongside of that, when we look at Louise Nevelson's exhibition history at that time, she is an incredibly busy individual. And these are just 2 sheets of exhibition records from her archives. And you can see she is continuing to rise in recognition. She is showing everywhere from Grand Central Moderns, the Whitney Museum of American Art, their annual show, lots of other places in between. She also shows with the Federation of Modern Painters and Sculptors, who do annual member shows. She's in the National Association of Women Artists annual shows. So all to say, she is gaining recognition. She's having group shows throughout the United States and really making a name of herself, leading up to her presentation in the Venice Biennale in 1962. And this is really a significant opportunity, unlike any other, where she is representing the United States on an international stage. You can see one of her installations here. At that time, she's creating 3 environments in rooms, and we know that she created one in black, white, and gold, which, looking back at the arc of her career, are the 3 color choices that she returned to over and over again. And what is so great is that this is occurring in 1962, and just less than 20 years later, Rockland is added to her exhibition history. But before we talk about that exhibition, I think it's important to really understand what it means to think about Louise Nevelson coming home to Rockland. And she shared this wonderful quote. I think reading about Nevelson, she was super articulate, sometimes contradictory, very humorous, but spoke quite fondly about Rockland, Maine. And here is a wonderful anecdote that she shared after a 1985 exhibition, when a lot of works that she and her family gave to the Farnsworth were on view. So she said, when I was growing up in Rockland, from grammar school to high school, there was no museum. One of the great joys of my life is that we have a first-rate one now, a beautiful building that encloses creative works that can stand with the great ones. That is something that I had not expected in my wildest dreams to find in a town of Maine. That jewel that shines. And you can see here is a picture of Louise with her classmates, although I cannot identify which one is her. So if anyone knows, I would love your assistance in pinpointing her in this photograph. And then, of course, we know she went to school here in Rockland. Her family immigrated in 1905. And at an early age, she received recognition from many of her teachers that she was an artist, and she often put that word in quotes as a child. But she would say, from the first day of school until the day I graduated, I received 100+ in art. And she would joke, where do you go in life? You go, where do you get 100+? And so this is another early drawing that is in her archives. And you can see, this kind of table setting and maybe dining room with figures and chairs. But again, this idea that this community was nurturing this young artist and supporting her, and thinking about, Maria Nevelson just shared 4 from the left. So let's go back and look at that. Thank you, Maria. Hold on, I can't. Four from the left. 1, 2, 3, 4. Amazing. Now we know. Thank you so much. So to go back to thinking about the Rockland community, in supporting young Louise in her artistic interests, it is understood or believed or written about that she first discovered what we might consider fine art at the Rockland Public Library, and a plastic cast of Joan of Arc. And we don't know if this is the exact plaster cast or one of similar ilk, but at that time there were a lot of sculptures produced in America and Europe at the turn of the 20th century of Joan of Arc that looked like this. And Nevelson shared that around this age, she and her friends were at the library, and she was in conversation with the librarian who came up to her and her friends, and she was just curious and sparked up a conversation and asked the young girls what they wanted to be when they grew up. And of course, out of nowhere, young Nevelson said, "I'm going to be an artist," but then quickly took back what she said, and she said, "No, I want to be a sculptor. I don't want color to help me." And so that kind of foreshadowing, she went on to talk about, scared her a little bit because she didn't know how she could articulate that so young, at such a young age, or where that thought came from. But of course, we know that in fact she did go on to be a sculptor. And what is so interesting that she used limited color palette and monochrome colors, in fact. And so now that we kind of have a framework for maybe why she felt so fondly of Rockland, amongst all of the many reasons and people and community that she had here, we can jump forward to 1979 and think about the exhibition that took place. This is an image of the artist in her studio around 1974, so a little bit before the exhibition. And so in December of 1976, the museum's third director, Marius P. Pelledo, started thinking about expanding the museum's exhibition program into contemporary art. And he was engaging artists like Nevelson, William Barnett, Robert Indiana, and Neil Welliver about exhibitions. And these exhibitions resulted in numerous gifts, particularly archival materials. And in the case of Louise Nevelson, what we'll learn is a special Louise Nevelson archive and a large bequest of paintings and sculpture and gifts from the artist herself. But the 1979 exhibition was a huge undertaking for the museum at the time. It was larger than anything the museum had done. And when the director first engaged the artist to ask if she was even interested, our records show that she was very enthusiastic about the idea, but the museum, to be able to support such an undertaking, as museums often do, applied for a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts. And so the director was very thoughtful, in knowing that sometimes grant applications don't go in museums' favor. He laid out 2 paths for the project: one if grant funding did not materialize, and one if it did. Thankfully, the National Endowment for the Arts supported this exhibition, which allowed the museum to not only mount the exhibition in the main galleries, but also travel the exhibition and produce a catalog. So what you're seeing here are some behind the scenes photographs from film strips that we had in our archive, which again, thinking about time, thinking about documentation, how do we catalog and record things? There's this timeless element to all of this, which I just think is fascinating. And so these are some shots that I'm not sure how rarely or often they've been shared. But something that was widely circulated at this time was the museum's annual report. And this is wonderful to me because there is this special gold leaf section that is dedicated to the Nevelson year. And I don't know if she ever saw this, but I can only hope that if she did, she would have laughed with quite joy, knowing that the very first paragraph compares her to Julius Caesar. And so I'm going to read it out loud because I just think it's tremendous. It says, if Julius Caesar could look out over Gaul and say, I came, I saw, I conquered, then Louise Nevelson can look back at the summer of 1979 as a year she came home to Rockland and also conquered. And so you can just see that this framing of her return to Rockland, Maine, set the tone for this wonderful 6-page spread in the annual report, which opens with works of art by her, then continues to show lots of wonderful images and write-ups about the history of the exhibition and how it came to be, to images of her on the ground, working with numbers of individual. What is so interesting to me is that press from all over the country came, including CBS Sunday Morning, which produced a show in 1981. Oh, I will get to that shortly. The New York Times was here, local newspaper was here, and when you look at these archival photos and other ones that exist, as well as watching CBS Sunday Morning's program that originally aired in 1981 that you can still find on the internet today. She was incredibly generous with her time and in the community, meeting with many, many people. It's annotated in this annual report that she attended a gala champagne reception of 200 people. Then 400 people came to a buffet luncheon in which she was honored. And then over the 2.5 months of the exhibition being on view from July to the end of September, 20,000 people visited this exhibition alone from across the country, which is just extraordinary. So you can see here some additional installation shots, Louise in the galleries. And so if you're familiar with the museum, this is the main building, what we know, and this, I believe, is what we call Hadlock Gallery. There's some wainscoting over here. These windows go up into Rothschild in that doorway, and they've covered some of the wainscoting as well. You see examples of her white sculptures, her black and her gold. Here's a still photograph from the CBS Sunday Morning program with Charles Osgood. And then our files also have some wonderful newspaper clippings from local newspapers, but also the far right clipping on your screen is from the New York Times. And there are wonderful quotes by her and her relatives that really build the persona of who Louise Nevelson was as an artist. I would say as an endurance artist, as someone who was completely passionate about her career and her determination. Her brother is quoted in there saying that she was a very, very driven, ambitious woman, even as a child. Her sister was quoted saying, "You couldn't beat her down. I would have given up a million times." And when Louise Nevelson is quoted in the article and asked how she feels about coming home to Rockland, the author says that the sculptor seems to be in high spirits as she graciously accepted the claim, and quoted Louise Nevelson saying, "I'd rather be kissed than not, so here I am." But I think the article ends on this wonderful quote that I think positions Nevelson in the way that we all know and understand her. So I'm going to read it to you. It says, quote, "From the beginning, in my blueprint, I projected all of this, so there are no surprises. I feel I have fulfilled my destiny. What I've done these last few years is the essence of my whole life. I brought it to fruition. In the end, I hope to put a period instead of a question mark on it before I go into another dimension. But let's say I'm going to live a lot longer, so I have a very little way to go. And that to me is really important because it just speaks to how everything she did throughout her career was with intention and the strategy behind it. And I think it is important to say that when she was in Rockland for this exhibition, it was just 2 months shy of her 80th birthday. So she was certainly someone still operating with a lot of stamina and a lot of determination. And I love this photograph and I love this memory, and I wish I had been there to celebrate, because on July 13th, the Rockland Mayor, Warren Perry, with Louise Nevelson and the director of the Farnsworth Art Museum, are celebrating what the City Council proclaimed to be Louise Nevelson Day, and gave her a quote key, which was actually a lobster measuring gauge, to the city of Rockland, which we know is the lobster capital of the world. So here you can see accepting that award. So the next time July 13th comes around, just make a little celebration to Miss Louise Nevelson. Here is the cover of the catalog that accompanied the show, and with this wonderful contribution and forward by the director. And the one quote that I'm going to read from you here is that when he writes, "There is no school of followers in her footsteps. Her work is her own and is so indelibly stamped with an imprint that no artist has imitated her art. Although she has, as Dorothy Miller says in the following introduction, exerted a great influence on contemporary art around the world, it is not an influence that has lent itself to imitation. It is the impact of her talent and of her artistic personality as an articulate spokeswoman for the arts, which has been the source of her influence." And then what I was also fascinated to learn by this is Nevelson somewhat selected who the curator of this exhibition would be. And this was a longtime, I guess, acquaintance or friend. I don't really know, but Jan Ernst Adelman, who you can see here, was also someone who grew up in Rockland, who had been fascinated by Louise's work for a really long time. And in this opening paragraph, really gives thanks to Nevelson for, I think, directing the course of this person's career. And I think that is just a beautiful testament in relationship and what seems to be kind of a finale of their life together. And as I mentioned early on, this exhibition, thanks to the support of the National Endowment for the Arts, was able to go beyond Rockland, Maine. So here we have the Farnsworth helping Louise Nevelson bring her work into different corners of the United States, everywhere from West Palm Beach to Jacksonville to Scottsdale, Arizona. Also interesting is to see what other institutions at this time were acquiring Louise's work. So lots of work at the Colby College Museum of Art. The Whitney Museum of Art also had works of art. There were other lenders such as the Currier Gallery of Art and Smith College, and of course, lots of private collectors. And Pace Gallery, who represented the artist at the time and continues to oversee her estate, also loaned major pieces. So this, like many loan exhibitions, was the result of numerous efforts to be able to mount such an ambitious projects of the time. The other important aspect of this show was the acquisition of Dawn Column 1, which you're seeing here on the left, which is part of this larger work, an installation behind, in this installation photograph, and of Dawn Wending's feast that was originally installed at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in the 16 American show. And during these events at the Farnsworth, towards the end of the exhibition, they made a community fund drive to purchase an example of Nevelson sculpture for the museum. And so there were a number of individuals who rallied around bringing this piece into Rockland, collection, into the Farnsworth collection for perpetuity, and it continues to be to this day. So if you come back to the Farnsworth and go upstairs, you will see it on view. But this community fundraising drive had important leadership gifts from the Honorable Mrs. Douglas Dillon, Mr. and Mrs. Robert Rothschild, and Mrs. Dorothy Adams Brown, among almost 50 other individuals and organizations. So again, this is one of those things where a community really rallied behind Louise Nevelson's work and her contributions to American art and sculpture, and knew that they wanted one of these works to permanently remain in the community. And what was so interesting, no sooner had this work been acquired by the Farnsworth and the Whitney Museum of American Art wrote to Nevelson and the Farnsworth, who at the time was working on a retrospective of her work, and requested it for loan. So they were restaging a part of Dawn's Wedding Feast, which had been broken up and sold off individually to museum and private collectors, initially against the artist will, who wanted to keep it intact. But sometimes those things happen. And so they were trying to get as many pieces as they could back together to reinstall them. So this is an installation view of the Whitney's retrospective. And it's such an important part when I started talking about outcomes of not only the exhibition and the number of people who were able to come and celebrate the work, and of course, Nevelson coming home to Rockland, was the establishment of the Louise Nevelson Archives. And this was in part because of how pleased Nevelson was of the museum's efforts to mount the exhibition, what a warm reception she felt in Rockland. And so she was really thinking about how to build a center for scholarship of art and about her career. So the first gift that ultimately made up the archives came from her brother, Nathan, who was such a devoted fan of his sister, and for many, many years had saved news clippings, photographs, materials. You can see this kind of example from a scrapbook that is now in the Archives of American Art, the types of materials that family members were saving at that time. I believe there's also another picture that I just saved. Here is a picture of Louise Nevelson and Andrew Wyeth at the Thorndike Hotel, which was owned by her brother. Her artist son, shortly thereafter, gave a lifetime collection of material on her mother. And this was really important and critical because he had saved a lot of invitations and announcement of really early exhibitions from the 1940s, which were otherwise no longer intact or available to anyone else. So this was incredibly generous of the family to rally and make this archives here at the Farnsworth Art Museum. But these gifts led to like an incredibly great climax when Nevelson herself announced that she would present files of her correspondence to the Farnsworth for inclusions of the archives. And for scholars, this type of primary source material is incredibly important when trying to study an artist's career and thinking about how to piece together someone's life. And her correspondence was from the 1950s to 70s. So that's a really pivotal point in her career. When we looked at some parts of her exhibition history, we know she was gearing up for the Venice Biennale in the years that predated the Farnsworth first exhibition. And some other materials that she gave to the Farnsworth at that time also dated back to the mid-1930s. So this was incredibly, incredibly generous. And again, went back to this idea of creating a center of on her work and scholarship. At the time that Louise Nevelson and her family were gifting these materials to the Farnsworth, the Archives of American Art was really considered a repository for microfilm. It had not yet moved into its current mission of really preserving original material that shifted around the same time. And so eventually they grew in their mission, in their capacity to take on full oral histories, full archives and really be a center for American art for archival information. So in 2018, the Farnsworth Art Museum, under the leadership of then curator Michael Komanecki, donated the Louise Nevelson archives over to the Archives of American Art. So you can see here now, with many other artist archives under the Smithsonian Institution, there is wonderful care being taken to study and to preserve all of her archives in one place. And this, as someone who is just quickly, since my time being here at the Farnsworth, I must go to this site all the time. A lot of things are digitized and easily accessible. If there's something that you can't find, you can go in and look for it. And they even have certain links directly to materials that the Farnsworth have given. So you can make those requests to see them. But the gifts didn't stop at the archives, nor did the Farnsworth relationship stop with Louise Nevelson and her family in 1979. From 1981 to 1985, leading up to another exhibition in 1985, Louise Nevelson donated 87 pieces of art to the museum. 87, including 56 of her own, some of which you're seeing here, early sculptures that predate the bronze bird, and 31 works, by other artists. We also see incredible gifts of art coming in from her brother. And this is amazing because when you are able to come back to the museum and see the current exhibition of her work, we often think of Louise Nevelson, the sculptor, but we're able to contextualize the full arc of her career and understand her artistic training, her interest as a painter when she's studying with Hans Hofmann in Germany, how she's already thinking about construction in space and dimension and two-dimensional form. And so these are really wonderful ways to understand a full narrative of an artist's intentions and growth. And this is another wonderful archival image that I just couldn't help to share. This is what I believe to be the lobby of the Thorndike Hotel. And you can see her brother is constantly had his sister's work on display, including this painting, Figure in a Blue Shirt, which is now in the Farnsworth collection and came into the collection in 1980. But it was just regularly on the walls in Rockland, Maine. And then when the family and Louise decided to make this generous gift, it is now in the very good hands of the museum. The other wonderful story that I just have to share is her brother also gifted this work Endless Column in advance of the 1985 exhibition. And we all know Nevelson was an incredible experimenter and innovator in sculpture. You can see this just by these 3 columns in the different ways in which she's constructed them. But when she was here to install this exhibition and work specifically on this piece, the story goes that the piece began as 3 rows of boxes to form a tall rectangle. But when she was preparing for the exhibition, she couldn't help herself but to add the top 3 rows, as well as the vertical construction flanking it, to, quote, better hold the space of the alcove in which it was displayed in at the time. So when you look at this work and you see the dates 1969 and 1985, that is because she first made the central part of the piece in 1969, but when she was here at the Farnsworth to install the exhibition in 1985, she recreated the piece. So to honor that lifespan of the object, it now has 2 dates, which I think is an artist who can't, I guess her experimentation and her constant mind and restlessness to make is always with her. And then, of course, we see these wonderful contributions from her sister, showing us different ways the artist is thinking about carving and sculpture in figurative form. And then I'm going to close with some current installation views of the exhibition. And I will say I did do a quick run of the exhibition history at Farnsworth, even though I was just focusing on the main 1979 show, and say that there have been over 14 solo exhibitions of Louise Nevelson at the museum, or her work being incorporated into other exhibitions. And I know that is just a very cursory glance, but imagine there have been many, many others along the way. So I think I will pause there, and we have some time for questions or conversation.
Thank you so much. Jamie, really fantastic. And I have to say, and maybe it's just me from the learning and engagement standpoint, but, the story again about Louise being this standout student that a teacher recognized and said, yes, go forward with your passion. And then, of course, that ended up being Louise Nevelson, so you never really know who that student is going to be. And so it just shows you that when you foster that idea of inspiration and passion and the community gets behind you, how fantastic. So it's really, really interesting, and to see the arc of her work also through Hans Hofmann and the paintings, that certainly led to the inspiration of ideas, through her sculpted works as well. So thank you very much for sharing, and thanks for tuning in. And we've got a couple questions here, so I'm going to look at the Q&A box. Bear with me for one moment. One question came in, and that is, did Louise ever speak about if and how her Jewish immigrant experience informed her art? Is that something that has been recorded, do you know?
That's a great question. I'm trying to think off the top of my head if she did. She was interviewed so many times, in her biographer, Lori Wilson, most likely would be the scholar to look to for that type of information on her original biography. I don't want to misquote, but I would look to Lori Wilson's work and scholarship on that to see if that's true or not.
Great, thank you. Another question has come in also about sort of the crafting of Louise Nevelson, of really how she kind of shaped her own legacy in a sense. And the question that's come in is that typical of artists at the time, in order to really sort of engage with the public. And think of the turnout she had here in 1979, also with CBS coming. If you could speak to that, that would be great.
I think it depends on the artist and their personality. I wish I had met her or had the opportunity to, but there's not a lot of existing videos, but the ones that there are, and you can see her, she's sometimes appears in performance mode or celebrity status. Even some of the headlines in the newspaper clippings refer to as like Rockland rolling out the red carpet. So she, I think, was someone who was very aware of being in the spotlight, but also was someone who was very comfortable in the studio. So I think a lot of artists know when they're supposed to be in business mode of turning it on. But I wouldn't say that's something artists necessarily feel comfortable doing at all times. I think she was just someone who maybe naturally gravitated to that type of environment at times when she had to.
Great, thank you. And there was another question also that's come in about her outdoor sculpture, and her work on the outdoor sculpture and our sculpture that we have at the Farnsworth about atmosphere and environment. If you could sort of just comment, I guess the question is that, in a sense, was some of her work really intended to be viewed outdoors, or was some of it being used inside as well? Or where was she kind of drawing these inspirations?
Some of her pieces, as her career continued, she was getting public commissions, and she was switching from wood to aluminum and materials that would sustain outdoor elements, if you will, in certain weather conditions. So she was certainly aware of that. I don't necessarily think every aluminum sculpture was made to be put outdoors. I don't think we can always make that determination unless we have certain records from Pace Gallery or the estate saying and knowing what the intentions of certain times, not so much for the aluminum works, but the woodworks, she would make and remake works or take things apart and reconstruct them. So a lot of times things don't exist anymore. But there continue to be public commissions that were intentionally made and they're monumental in scale for outdoors. I don't know if that really answers the question or not.
No, I think that's certainly helpful to give us some context. And also, I'm going to chime in at Marie Nevelson. Thanks very much for commenting on the question about Muriatis writes, my grandmother did not rely on being Jewish to inform her work and didn't discuss her work in those terms. So thanks very much. That's really helps us answer that question. And I have one last question for you here, and that is whether or not there was any sort of cross intersection with the members of the Ogunquit art colony and Louise Nevelson. And of course, we know that in this area of Maine, there have been so many artists to have passed through and certainly dividing their time between Maine and New York as well. Do we know for sure if there's been any intersection there?
Ruth, that is a great question. I don't know how often Louise was coming back to work in Maine, or if she was primarily staying in her studio in New York, or sojourns to Europe, or going down to Mexico. I don't recall her coming back to Maine to insert herself into artist colonies, but that is certainly something to look into, and I'm happy to do that and email you.
Great. Thank you. All sorts of good questions today, and lots to think about as you have really initiated some of us to Nevelson and certainly helped some of our devotees to Nevelson get their curiosity up. So Jamie, I really want to thank you for your time today. And I want to thank all of our members and all of our friends and our soon-to-be members and soon-to-be friends, as I like to say here at the Farnsworth Art Museum. And I want to also thanks to Amy and Catherine, who's running the tech in the background for Learning Engagement team. We couldn't do it without you, so thank you. Certainly stay tuned to our website and our e-blasts for updates on our 75th anniversary exhibition. It will be unveiled to the public in the middle of February. We're opening up again on February 11th. Very excited to see you back here in the galleries. We'll be celebrating with members and community events coming up in February. And then, of course, we're also getting ready for another local favorite, and the St. Vincent Millay will be celebrating her poetry on February 25th. So many new acquisitions to look forward to. And of course, the reopening of the Nevelson Gallery, along with all the other galleries, February 11th. So please join us. Please come back and see us. And that is it for today. Thanks, Jamie. And thank you for all for tuning in here. And do visit us next time online or certainly in the galleries. Thanks again.